This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's what most videos in this series do. Sometimes I take a break from those more evidence-based videos to do something more subjective and biographical, and that's what I'm doing today. A few weeks ago, I talked about 10 bad cards that I thought were awesome when I first started playing Magic when I was a kid, and it got some pretty good feedback. This is something of a companion piece to that because here I'll be looking at cards that were good, but I thought they were bad when I was a kid. Evaluating cards perfectly is impossible, even for the most seasoned players, but 10 and 11-year-old me was particularly bad at it. If you started playing the game when you were quite young, you probably have a list of your own that would contain a lot of cards from the sets that were new when you started playing. For me, that primarily means Urzas, Masks, and Invasion blocks. Figuring out certain cards are good that you thought were bad is a good way to learn new things about Magic, and in this video, when applicable, I'll talk about what the cards taught me about the game, and I'll also discuss what my thought process was that led me to think the card was bad in the first place. While this video is subjective and based on my own experiences, I did use a bit of data to make the list. The definition for good in this video is either that the card has top 8'd at least one Premier event, or it's widely played in EDH. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, I have Raths Edge. This land didn't seem great to me. I mean, paying 4 mana and sacrificing another land for a single damage? How is that even close to being a good deal? And I mean, I wasn't exactly wrong in thinking that. If you just isolate the activated ability on this card, it definitely isn't something you'd describe as good. The problem is, when you look at lands with activated abilities, you really have to take into account the fact that the card is, well, a land. Utility lands like this often have abilities that don't look especially efficient, but this card can produce mana for you in the early game, and then in the late game you can start killing X1s or doing 1 to your opponent every turn. It was played in aggro decks while it was in standard since it provided some nice reach. It might not quite be Ramunap Ruins, but I think that comparison helps you understand how it ended up being utilized. But yeah, Rath's Edge really taught me to value utility lands a lot more. At number 9, I have Cavern Harpy, and it kind of stands in for all the gating creatures in Planeshift. These were a cycle of gold creatures that, when they entered, made you return a creature with one of the same colors to your hand. Not all of the gating creatures turned out to be good, but enough of them did. I couldn't really understand how the Harpy in particular could be good. I mean, yeah, for only 2 mana you get a 2/1 flyer, but having to return another creature to your hand sort of negates the efficiency. Or, at least, that's what I thought. Cavern Harpy can allow you to return creatures and rebuy their Enter the Battlefield abilities, and it can do it over and over again, since you can pay 1 life to return it to your hand. In short, Cavern Harpy can be a very real engine in the right deck, and I just didn't see the combo potential. I thought of the bounce effect as only downside, but that just isn't how it panned out. Cavern Harpy ended up being a key card in extended Allure Index, which ran a bunch of cheap creatures it could cast for free, along with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and the Harpy was key for that deck. Cavern Harpy's success in general made me realize the value of rebuying Enter the Battlefield triggers. At number 8, I have Squee, Goblin Nabab. For 11-year-old me, the fact this returned to your hand every upkeep wasn't enough to overcome the fact that it was a 3-mana 1/1. Who cares if it keeps coming back if it's so small and inefficient, right? The main mistake I made here was evaluating Squee as the kind of creature that you actually cast on a regular basis. In the end, it turned out that Squee was good at providing you with fuel for various discard effects since you could effectively use it every turn without giving up anything real. It was the most potent with Survival of the Fittest since you could use it to tutor up whatever you wanted every single turn. At number 7, I have both tanglewire and smokestack. I don't blame young me that much for being wrong about these two cards, because cards like this are pretty hard to grasp regardless of your age and experience level. I mean, look at those text boxes. Both of these cards have symmetrical effects, and I didn't like that. I thought they would hurt me just as much as my opponent, but I was obviously dead wrong. Both of them greatly benefit the player who played them. This is partly because you can build a deck around them, but it's also because you have a lot more control over these permanents than it might seem. With Tanglewire, the artifact itself counts, so you can tap it in addition to other permanents, and because you play it on your turn and decide when to play it, you can put it down at a time where it really hurts your opponent, and because of how fading works, your opponent would tap down more things as a result of this card than you would. Smokestack is similar. You can just keep it around until you don't want it around anymore, since it can be sacrificed to itself. Both of these cards have enabled prison decks in multiple formats for about 20 years. At number 6, it is Fluctuator. In addition to not realizing how good this card was, I also had no idea what its name was at the time, and I distinctly remember calling it Fluctuator. But yeah, I didn't see any real value in making cycling cost 2 less. I mean, what's so great about cycling anyway? It just lets you draw a card, and you have to give up a card to do it. Problem was, pretty much all the cycling in Urza's block cost exactly 2 colorless, and Fluctuator effectively made it free. If you built your deck correctly, you could pretty much rip through the whole thing, and once you do that, winning the game isn't that hard. Fluctuator ended up being so good that it got banned in Standard. At number 5, I have Plow Under. By the point I saw this card, I understood the power of land destruction pretty well, but I looked at this card as significantly worse than a land destruction spell. I mean, they're definitely going to be getting their lands back, and I don't want that to happen. I'd rather just blow up a land permanently. However, in a lot of ways, this type of effect is better than traditional land destruction. Making your opponent spend 2 draws drawing the lands that they used to have in play effectively makes it a 2-for-1, and it's one that still sets your opponent back on mana significantly. I was sort of looking at Plow Under as a bounce spell, but it is just way better than that, and in general, my incorrect evaluation of this card made me realize that putting things on top of my opponent's library is actually pretty good, and I shouldn't fixate on the fact that it means they will get back whatever I put there. Plow Under saw significant play in a variety of standard and extended decks. At number 4, I have Phyrexian Negator. This is another one where I don't blame myself a ton for getting it wrong, since the downside here is pretty darn enormous. Every single point of damage the Negator takes causes you to sacrifice a permanent. That means your opponent can just lightning bolt it to make you lose 3 permanents, and that's terrible. However, the efficiency of the Negator is impressive as a 3-mana 5/5 with trample, and many decks effectively utilized it in Standard, Extended, and even Legacy. It was mostly played as a sideboard card, one that black aggro decks could bring in against control decks. Those decks didn't generally run very many creatures or sources of damage, so the downside here didn't come up that much. In those situations, the Negator can quickly end a game. It was also a mainboard card in aggro decks that just planned on getting blockers out of the way. In those decks, you were kind of dead if you didn't kill your opponent quickly anyway, so running the huge creature was worth the downside. The Negator really taught me that some creatures might have big downsides, but they can be worth it in the right situations. At number 3, I have Show and Tell. This is another effect where I thought the downside was too high. Putting something huge into play for 3 mana is good, but how can you know that your opponent can't take advantage of it too? But it turns out Show and Tell helped spawn an entire archetype that found success in Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. The plan is to either make sure your opponent doesn't have good stuff in their hand with discard spells, or just to make sure you are always playing the best creature possible when you cast it. The kind of creature that is so good, it doesn't really matter what your opponent does. In the olden days, that was a Chroma, and these days, it's usually a massive Eldrazi. At number 2, I have Daze. So, by the time Daze came out, I understood the power of free spells pretty well, but I didn't think this one was going to be worth it. I mean, all your opponent had to do to ignore it was pay a single mana, and I felt like opponents would be able to pay that way too often. I mean, it's only 1 mana, right? Well, it turns out people tap out a lot in games of Magic, and they are even more likely to do so if they think you can't interact with them on their turn. As a result, Daze ended up countering a lot more spells than I expected, and in fact, it went on to become one of the best counterspells in all of Magic. And at number 1, I have Rishadan Port. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how I underestimated utility lands, but that wasn't my only problem with the port. I also just didn't understand what it was capable of. First, I didn't really know how it could be effective, as I thought if my opponent would just add mana to their mana pool in response, it wouldn't matter. And while they can do that, if you time Rishadan Port correctly, you end up taking away one of your opponent's lands every turn. You can use it at the end of their turn to take counter magic off the table, or you can use it on their upkeep, where they will only be able to use the mana if they have an instant. Still, even taking that into account, I also didn't know why it would be worthwhile for me to tap another land and my port to take away one of my opponent's lands, but this is again where the power of utility lands can come in. You can wait to start using it until you don't have other stuff to do, and once you start doing it, it can really mess up your opponent. Rishadan Port has gone on to be one of the most powerful and heavily played lands in all of Magic. Well, those are the 10 cards that I thought were bad, but actually turned out to be good. If you want to own any of these great cards, in the description you'll find direct links to the Card Kingdom store for each card that made this list. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you're not already a subscriber and you want to stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on some of the almost 400 MTG top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Lastly, if you like hearing me talk about Magic, you might also like hearing me talk about history, which I do on my other YouTube channel, Need to Hone History. Thanks for watching.